Recently, I was traveling through the Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. And while it may not be the biggest airport in the world, it is the busiest. Prior to the pandemic, the airport handled an astounding 110.5 million passengers a year. The other day, I happened to notice the vast majority of travelers did so with their heads down and their eyes looking downward. On the train, the woman standing next to me held on to the handle and proceeded to stare blankly at the floor. As I passed the restaurants in the airport, I noticed nobody was watching the televisions suspended from the ceiling, but were looking down at their meal. At the terminal, there were those around me at gate C21 that just eyed their plane ticket. And then once I was on the plane, I had the pleasure of sitting in the middle seat between two larger persons. The guy on my left looked down and watched the baseball game on his phone. The guy on my right kept looking down the aisle to check out the flight attendant until she no longer passed by. He got bored and then fell asleep. For the record, this didn't just happen in Atlanta. I made the same observations in Baltimore and Chicago and Buffalo. Almost everyone's eyes looked down, and it just felt kind of odd. A few days later, it dawned on me that the others have stolen my signature move. That's what I do. And this is what I've been doing since the early 90s. I can remember the day that I learned that move. I was at the intersection of Ontario Ave and 22nd Street in Niagara Falls. When my family would visit my grandma, we always walked to Tops. We'd start out on Niagara Avenue, walk up 22nd Street, and turn right at the traffic light on Ontario Ave. And just before we crossed the threshold of the automatic doors of Tops, my grandma and my mom would remind us to look with your eyes, not with your hands. And they would warn us, do not ask for anything. And when we left Tops, we would return home down High Park Boulevard to window shop in the drugstore's toy section and to browse the aisles of Five and Dime. You know, we must have made that trip hundreds of times over the years. And honestly, they all sort of seem to blend together in one indistinguishable memory. Except for one late spring day near the intersection of Ontario Ave and 22nd Street. As an elementary-aged kid, I would walk ahead of my grandma and my mom as she pushed my youngest sister in a stroller. And as I approached the corner of Ontario Ave and 22nd Street, waiting for my family to finally arrive, I happened to look down and was disgusted by a fast food bag from Wendy's someone had crumpled up and probably tossed from their car at the stoplight. The bag was mostly squished, but when it landed on the narrow strip of grass between the road and the sidewalk, a wrinkled receipt had slid out with a $5 bill wrapped in it. And I was beyond thrilled at my treasure. And my family shared in my excitement. At the risk of being melodramatic, I wish I never would have found that $5 bill. The small discovery at the corner of Ontario Ave and 22nd Street has had a profound and significant impact on my life. For over 30 years, I have trained hard and perfected the art of looking down. And now I wonder what beauty I most certainly missed with my attention always focused on the ground. Oh, I regularly find pennies crossing a parking lot or traveling down the sidewalk or while standing in the checkout lane. But such a way of living comes with a price. I mean, how many times looking down did I fail to see a sparrow tending to her young up in the corner of the porch? Or how many times looking down did I find a parking lot full of drowned worms following a rainstorm and totally miss the rainbow when it stretched across the horizon? How many times looking down did I discover a pile of discarded cigarette butts and was left unaware of a friendly smile of a stranger? Perhaps looking down symbolically alerts us to the host of anti-hero actions of humanity. From the beginning, the church has called Christ's followers to live upwardly and outwardly. The saints of old warned of the danger of a sinful nature that turns us downward and inward. What if we considered looking down a catch-all phrase for all of the activities that we must divest from? Because they are counterintuitive for who we are and what we are to be as a resurrection people. Last Sunday evening, at the conclusion of our Lenten study on the Gospel of Luke, someone pointed out a couple of lines from Luke's account of the Easter story. When the gospel writer states, in their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the two men, dressed in dazzling white, said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." Traveling through a handful of our nation's airports magnified and mirrored for me the human condition. And I began to wonder, what do we forfeit when we keep our eyes glued to the floor or our electronic devices? How often do we spend our days, even on Easter morning, looking for Jesus in all the wrong places? Was Vanessa Williams right when she sang, sometimes the very thing you're looking for is the one thing you can't see? What wondrous things do we continually miss because we give ourselves to a life of finding pennies and candy wrappers and pull tabs? On this Easter morning, we divert our eyes to consider the lofty words of Paul to the church in Colossae. Paul does not write to the Colossians from the comfort of his study, but the dark, damp confines of a dungeon below ground. He is likely malnourished and may be suffering from a horrible illness. When he declares, "Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God." Oswald Chambers, in his classic devotional, "My Utmost for His Highest," once advised, the first thing that will hinder your joy is the subtle irritability caused by giving too much thought to our circumstances. And Paul has every reason to take his eyes off of Jesus and to turn inward and look downward. And none of us can fault a man beaten within an inch of his life and nursing his injuries of giving too much thought to his current circumstances. And yet when the air around Paul is foul, with the stench of rot, excrement, and death. Nothing could stamp out his Easter joy. Literally, out of the depths, Paul instructs the growing, flourishing, multi-ethnic congregation in Colossae to set your hearts on things above. Or to borrow Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, look up. The imperative to look up is addressed to the holy and faithful brothers in Christ at Colossae. Paul implies that the congregation has a general understanding of holy baptism. Through baptism, the Colossians are already initiated into Christ's holy church. Through baptism, they are already incorporated into God's mighty acts of salvation. Those baptized have already received new birth through water and the Spirit. And even if the members of Colossae get lost in the theological thickness of holy baptism, they would have understood how their own baptism walks them through the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Paul banks on this connection as he reminds them in Colossians 2:12 that they were buried with Christ in baptism and raised with him through their faith in the power of God who raised Jesus from the dead. Theologian Karl Moll once said, "New life in Christ is a free gift from God, but it carries a challenge." The challenge for the Colossians remains the same for us today. We tend to look down and pursue those things that do not allow us to mature and to grow in the vitality offered to us in Christ. Instead of looking up or setting our hearts on things above, we sabotage ourselves, clinging to the ways that bring about our own destruction. Anger and rage and malice and slander and filthy language. We continue to be pulled back to the intersection of Ontario Ave and 22nd Street, wasting our lives looking for what does not satisfy: pennies and notoriety, candy wrappers and status, pull tabs and positions of power. And they all add up to a dead end. Paul understands the challenge and dares us. If you're serious about living this new resurrection life with Christ, act like it. Earlier, Paul calls us to walk worthily of the Lord in order to fully please God, bearing fruit in every good work and growing in the knowledge of God. So how do the claims in your baptism impact your life? What do you pursue today? Do you shuffle along, eyes to the ground, absorbed with the things right in front of you? Where are your eyes looking right now? How are you being attentive to the transformative work of God in the world? When was the last time you looked through the lens of your newfound life in Christ and saw things from the perspective of our reigning, redeeming, and risen Lord? My favorite story from the rabbinic tradition is a tale of two Israelites standing at the shore of the Sea of Reeds as it was parting. And apparently the bottom of the sea, although safe to walk on, was not completely dry and still a bit muddy. And Reuben stepped in first and curled his lip. "What is this mud?" he asked with disgust. Simon scowled as he stepped in next. "There's mud all over the place," he remarked. This is just like the slime pits of Egypt, replied Reuben, growing increasingly annoyed. What's the difference? Complained Simon. Mud there, mud there, it's all the same. And so it went on for the two of them, grumbling all of the way across the bottom of the sea. And the rabbis note that Reuben and Simon, with walls of water on either side of them, missed the greatest miracle in the history of Jewish people because they never looked up. On this Easter morning, let us not make the same mistake. Paul summons us to look up. We look up because our identity is bound in Jesus Christ. We look up to learn from and about Jesus. It is not always easy to look up. It is a challenge some days dealing with health or financial concerns. It's hard to look up when the news footage cuts to a community wrestling with another school shooting or left picking up the pieces after a tornado touched down. Frankly, it's difficult to remember to look up when there is so much to do and so little time to do it. And yet we must look up. We must look up if we are going to strive to live like Jesus. When we look up, we can more readily identify or readily imitate the one we see, his ethics, his values, his attitudes, and his actions. And every time we look up and intentionally choose to live into our baptism, by embodying compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, we offer evidence of the vitality of the resurrection. Every time we look up and model Jesus' forgiveness and love in the world, we indicate that the power of the resurrection is alive and well as it surges through us. And perhaps there is nothing